Philip Ackerman-Leist, thank you for joining me.
I'm really glad to be here with you, Garrett. Thank you for inviting me.
The purpose of this video really is for folks who, again, feel a distance or an apprehension from engaging with food systems or the natural world. It seems like you've been growing food, working with animals. Who inspired you to be looking into organic agriculture?
Well, it definitely didn't start in organic agriculture. I was working with my grandfather as a teenager and then more and more as I was in college and right out of college. And he was a plant pathologist at North Carolina State University. So I was working with him on his farm, which is in the Sandhills region of North Carolina. And, we had 192 acres, I believe it was, the farm there. Peaches, watermelons, cantaloupes, grapes, strawberries, just about anything you could grow in terms of fruits and lots of vegetables. But it certainly wasn't organic. There were times if someone was spraying nearby or you came into the orchards a couple of hours later or even a couple of days, there was that smell. Or if we were sitting on the porch and someone was spraying, we would catch that. There was a yearning on my side to step out and beyond that world, to get out of the fog, although, I learned a tremendous amount just by being with him. So perhaps it was a good thing to have both a balance of the conventional ag perspective and the organic perspective in the long run.
Can you point to one interaction that first inspired you to look deeper into organic?
It was when I first went to the Alps as a college student in 1983 and was studying the farming practices there, that I started to see here we have this history of thousands of years in which people are farming. And, obviously they've not been using pesticides. It's not that they aren't there, but, in fact, there was this long tradition of being organic, living organic, dwelling organic. And that was just a wonderful realization to me, to be able to see that there was a way to live a life without all of those synthetic pesticides.
I wonder if you could help the viewers imagine some of the joys, either growing food or working with animals. Tell us what images come to mind.
There was something that I discovered in my late teenage years, early 20s, about getting out on a farm, and in this case, really conventional or organic, and having these tasks in front of you in which the product is so palpable. It's there. It's part of the daily sustenance. It's real. It's exercise. It's kinetic. And so there's just this real satisfaction that comes with it. But then it's not always satisfaction in the sense of total pleasure. There's also the satisfaction of finding the grit to get through a particular task. There was something about farming that was real in terms of that level of engagement, because there was meaning to it. There was a product at the end of the day, and that's what I found so challenging and exciting by virtue of that challenge.
So many folks seem to have a lack of experience around farming systems, growing food for themselves. What do you want them to know or to understand about agriculture?
To appreciate its complexities, to realize that even as we're trying to find these particular values that resonate with ourselves, to understand how complex agriculture is in terms of an intellectual enterprise and also a physical enterprise, and to really start to not just have the conversations about, this is my diet and this is what I believe, but really to engage the people who are out there and doing it. And so it's finding that relationship, with the farmers, or, can also be with the butchers or the food processors, or the people at the grocery store who are putting the food out, there in the produce aisles. There's a conversation to be had there. So it's always a matter of stretching our understanding and therefore our values. And so I guess that's really what it gets at. Values should not necessarily be static. I mean, we tend to think of them as anchors and stable, but I think if our understanding of agricultural systems really is evolutionary, then so are our values. And that's not to say they're transient and that they don't still have meaning, but they need to shift with understanding.
In your book, A Precautionary Tale, you talk about the sheer amount of pesticides used at the height of what you call Big Apple. And I'm wondering if you can explain the similarities between Big Apple in Italy and Big Ag in the US.
So apples in the South Tyrol region of the Alps, which is where I lived, they've over time really become a dominant agricultural crop, because people make so much money growing apples, at least they do at the current point in time. And so right now, and on 1 hectare, which is 2.5 acres, they're actually on average in this region, they're spraying 42 kilograms of pesticides, synthetic pesticides per year, which is an enormous amount of synthetic pesticides. And so, what they've done there, instead of having corn and soy, essentially that's sort of the American equivalent in many ways, they're growing apples, although I have to say that their net profits growing apples is much better than growing corn and soy in the United States. So there, first of all, there's a contrast, and then there's a comparison. There's a contrast in that these farmers are growing typically on 4 to 6 acres, not hectares, but 4 to 6 acres. And so they're still making these handsome profits as they're doing that. So they're smaller scale, but at the same time, the comparison is that when we think about the Midwest, we think about corn and soy, folks doing that. It's the fact that anytime you start to grow a monoculture, then your paradigm also begins to take on the shape of a monoculture. And so you start to see things really through a very limited lens in many ways. And of course, it's your sole focus, it's your sole interest, it's the piece that is making your living and you're wedded to it. And so it's really hard for you sort of to start to pull those blinders apart a little bit so that your perspective is broader. And so that's the challenge, I think, in both places, is really opening the eyes of the farmers to other opportunities, but also helping consumers understand just really what this monocultural mindset does to our agricultural landscape. And even, that transcends into the grocery store shelves.
I'm very interested in this idea of farmers and other community members who become activists. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why community members and farmers in the book found it so necessary to protect their food heritage and their way of life from the encroaching apple industry.
The town of Maltz is actually made up of 11 municipalities, 11 villages. It's about 92 square miles. And if you can imagine, it's set up in this corner of the South Tyrol region where Switzerland, Austria, and Italy all come together. And it's at the highest part of what's called the Finchgau Valley, or Val Venosta there in Italy. And so it's perched there, and it's at the upper end of that valley. So it's been pretty protected from the apple industry because of the elevation up until this point. With climate change kicking in, that's made a big difference. So now apples can be grown higher. So suddenly you've got this food heritage that people can document back to the time of the Iceman, who was found in the mountains right above this valley. They can go back to the Iceman and further and say, listen, we've got 5, 6 more millennia even of food traditions and growing without these synthetic pesticides. And we have a diversified agriculture. We have the diets that are associated with that diversified agriculture. And suddenly, if we shift to this monocultural mindset and this monocultural landscape only of apples, then we've lost all of this heritage, and potentially forever. So that's when people decided that they needed to stand up, and stand up in a place where people usually go pretty quietly with the status quo. It's not a place where people tend to like to rock the boat a lot, but folks decided that, the boat itself was endangered. So it was time to go ahead and shake in whatever way they needed to make the changes.
So I'm interested in their success in organizing, just the strategies that they were using. And one that I thought was most inspiring was the use of art as activism. And I'm wondering, a follow-up to that, why creativity is needed to advance, I'll say, the movement for the survival of biodiversity.
I think the people in Maltz realized that they could have the debates day in and day out every night of the week, and trying to figure out what was the best strategy, who was right about the health impacts of synthetic pesticides and who was wrong. But at the end of the day, in order to protect the things they cherish, they decided really to celebrate those things. And so that's really when the art kicked in, because their sense of aesthetic, I think, is also tied very tightly to our sense of values. And so as they were able to really sort of to lift up the things that they valued and put those forward and say, these are the things that are so important to us. And if we're willing simply to dismiss of those, then what have we lost? We've lost the beauty. We've lost the culture. We've lost our very being in essence. And so art was very central to them, and guerrilla arts, really in the best fashion. For example, you've got this place is sort of known in the area as a paradise. And that's the way they've seen it in living there. And so then suddenly you have the apple. So they take the art form of the serpent and the Adam and Eve story, and they use that motif and they exploit it, really to the benefit of their cause. And so that's really where things got to be a lot of fun with that guerrilla art and the Adam and Eve concept and the temptation of Big Apple.
I really think it's, critical to start to weave in that creativity, that celebration.
And it's so challenging, I think, when we're doing the kind of activist work and educational work that you and others at Beyond Pesticides are doing, because some days it's a downer. And so we have to find ways to celebrate what it is that we're protecting. And ultimately, that was really the message of the people of Maltz, was instead of saying no to pesticides and, that's all the foot stamping and the table pounding, they decided to say yes to a pesticide-free future. And that was a very, very intentional moment in the whole campaign when a beekeeper, Pia Oswald, said, we are not in the banners that we put up. We're not going to use negative words. We're not going to use no, not, never. We're going to use the positive words and really frame this as the pesticide-free future that we can all get behind. And that was huge. That really, probably from my perspective, that made perhaps the biggest difference in this campaign and allowed it to go forward in the way that it did and still is.
I'll ask, just because I'm summarizing a great book and a few questions. Do you have other points you feel you want to address about the book?
I think one of the things that the people of Maltz did so well was to embrace direct democracy, and this notion that, representative government certainly has its place, has its role and its importance. But there are times when the people themselves need to speak and not channel their voices through others. So what they did in putting this forward that gave them the precedent of the first community in the world to have a public referendum in which they voted to eliminate all pesticides, that is, vote for a pesticide-free future. They did that through a binding referendum. And binding in this case meant that the town council had to take up the issue. It didn't tell them what to do or how to do it, but they had to take it up. And, so expressing the will of the people when the people themselves feel encumbered by the actions of others, then, that was a really critical piece of the story. And of course, that doesn't just limit itself to the pesticide campaigns. That also is the issue when we're dealing with any toxins, any poisons, any other issues in our lives. That direct democracy is something in the United States that we ourselves could afford to do a bit more often, I think.